Ooh, yeah, I love spoilers. I'm a spoiler guy. I talk about spoilers. Good evening, and welcome to the second part of my analysis on the lore of Rainworld the Watcher. This time we'll be discussing the Ancients, specifically the new stuff we've learned, but we'll also do a bit of an overview because, I'll be honest, I've been wanting to remake this old video of mine for a while now, and I can't think of a better opportunity to do so. A quick disclaimer before we begin, though. The world of the Watcher is not canon to the other DLC, Rainworld Downpour, as far as we know. And I know some real loreheads are gonna get on me if I dare touch this expansion with something stained with Downpour's grubby fingers, so I'm not gonna be including any information we learn in Downpour. Cool? So, without further ado, let's get started by discussing the lore of the Ancients in base game Rainworld before we move on to what we learn in the Watcher. Starting off, what are the Ancients? Well, fairly loaded question, that's the whole point of the video, so let's start with a more specific question. What were the Ancients? Well, that's also complicated, but less so, due to the fact that we don't really know anything about the Ancients at the start. As far as we're aware, the Ancients started out as any other creature, maybe a hominid or some other humanoid species. I'll go a bit deeper into how they probably look later down the line, but in general, I'm going to be taking a lot of assumptions and just kind of assuming that the Ancient Society is fairly similar to human society, unless specifically proven otherwise in the game's text. Going along with this thread of logic, it's likely that they hunted and gathered before transitioning into agriculture, before eventually developing into a larger interconnected society. Though something was entirely unique about the Ancients and their predicament. After the Ancients had achieved the necessities of life like food, water, shelter, and general comfort, they were left to contend with the laws of the world, more specifically, the Great Cycle. The Great Cycle is nebulous, as always, but being very brief, it basically means you come back when you die. Whether that's reincarnation or a more basic time loop, it sucked nonetheless for almost everyone involved. As an ancient, your life was more or less eternal, and as predicted, a lot of people got sick of it. This gave rise to the first ascensionist movements. There were a bunch of theories, but the main important one we'll talk about is the theory of the 5 natural urges. Yeah, I know I called them karmic sins in my last video. Listen, I think it's a cool name. But they're officially called the 5 natural urges. This theory stated that in order to properly die, you must first abate all the things that tied you to life, the main ones listed being violence, procreation, companionship, gluttony, and self-preservation. We learned through the Red Farmeray's Pearl that there was a push towards monkhood, to the extent that these monks would starve themselves in order to abate Urge 4, drinking nothing but gravel and bitter herbal tea. There was also a trend of wearing masks that continued well after this. At first they were made of bone and made by the monks. The purpose of these masks was to abate the self, to remove your connection to your own face and feel more transient. This culture of detachment, as I'll come to call it, that rose from ascensionism, is a really important part of the Ancients in general. The purpose of this culture was, as mentioned, ascension, which is a complete removal from the grand cycle and arguably a proper final death. But it's a bit more complicated than that. There's another pearl that's even older than the last one we spoke about. The lime green pearl found in Drainage System discusses the primary views of ascensionism. They view the world as a tangled rug, describing it as a knot that locks every part in place. Then it describes the world as an animal hide, with us being the bugs that squirm around inside it. Then finally it describes the world as a fishing net that we're all caught in. Struggling only makes us get tangled more. The only way to pass through it would be to be like a jellyfish. The jellyfish is effortless, and it doesn't strive at all, so it simply passes right through the net. This quote from Moon sums up the Ancients quite well. They were burdened by great ambition, yet deeply convinced that striving in itself was an unforgivable vice. They tried very hard to be effortless. Very cool stuff. This early culture was full of religion and spiritualism, with many aspects of ancient culture that we know as quite modern, dating back to here. However, a lot changed after a discovery was made. As the Ancients dug down, they eventually ended up finding something deep underground, a massive sea of highly corrosive golden fluid, known as void fluid. This fluid was used in a whole bunch of stuff, but its main use was fairly simple. It melted you real good. So good, in fact, that it ascended you. Yep, it was that easy. They found the juice that kills you forever. This event was known as the Void Fluid Revolution, as not only was the Void Fluid the thing they've been looking for this whole time, it was also an incredible energy source. Limitless destructive potential could easily be turned in a different direction, but wait, that doesn't sound right. If the ancients found the way out, why didn't they all just leave? Well, we're looking at this from the outside. We're studying the ancients from a very limited portion of text. It's highly likely that not every ancient was an ascensionist. If aliens looked at Earth, they'd think that we were all Christians or Muslims or Buddhists without too much variety. Ascensionism was a very popular religion, but it very likely wasn't the only one. There could have been ancient atheists, or hell, just people who didn't want to die immediately. Either way, those that chose not to hop into the slop decided to make life better for everyone else. They developed huge-ass drills to dig up vast quantities of void fluid, filtering it of the rocks and dirt that were still suspended in it, and then used that pure void fluid for all sorts of things. Ascensionism took a big hit because you didn't really need to do all that boring monk shit to ascend. It was right there. You could pump it into your house and take the last shower of your life, but there was something more complex that caused people to still go for the old ways. Call it an urban legend, I suppose, but there was a theory that if you were too attached, you'd remain, splayed between the cycles as an echo. Now, we know this is a real thing that happened to people, but as far as we know, the ancients didn't. Passing through was scary. I imagine many people were still scared and wanted the insurance of knowing they did everything quote-unquote right before they took the final dip. The Pearls around this time discussed the nature of a life where death was possible. They knuckled down with this new power source and started to innovate on their technologies, beginning the age of purposed organisms. Creatures designed to effectively act as how we would use machines. For example, the memory crypts stored the memories of ascended ancients in the bodies of huge fleshy creatures locked in metal cages. These purposed organisms made life even easier, and eventually the ancients would take full dominion over their world, holding the tools to mold even life itself. Void fluid and ascension were held in ascensionist temples. The depth is an example of one of these. But as time passed and void fluid became a bit more normalized, we saw a bit of distrust in the void fluid. Perhaps it was due to the echoes, but we still don't know if any ancients ever actually saw one of them. But this brought rise to a great problem, name pending. The problem that asked if there was a way to ascend without the use of void fluid. The advent of the Great Problem caused a huge shift in ancient society, easily the most notable of which being the invention of the Iterators. If you know Rainworld, you know the Iterators. They're basically giant flesh calculators, inarguably the ultimate in purposed organism technology. Iterators are godlike, gigantic biological computers larger than a city. Their purpose was to solve the Great Problem, but in order to do so, they used up a bunch of water, which then turned into rain. The rain fell harder each time, and eventually, those ancients living on the ground level were forced to move on top of their own creations in order to continue living peacefully. And live peacefully they did. For the rest of their existence, the ancients lived lives of relative luxury atop their creations, holding council meetings and pretending like they still did things other than decay. Eventually, they all decided to ascend. Whether this was a singular mass ascension event or a slow tapering off, they vanished nonetheless. Many, many cycles of stagnation later, we get to the base game of Rainworld. That's more or less all that the base game tells us. The decay of the ancients occurred atop their gigantic metal creations in various islands all across the distance, slowly tapering off until there was nothing left, and they left the world up to the animals and the Iterators. That's all well and good, but you already know that. I've just been recounting exactly what the base game tells us. I could have done this 3 years ago. No. The main focus of this video is going to be on what the Watcher tells us about the ancients. So starting off, we should probably discuss the smaller things the DLC tells us. The Watcher is, in general, a very subdued DLC when it comes to telling us stuff. This is primarily due to the lack of lore pearls. However, there are many things we can glean from the regions themselves. Now, there is an important question here. Is the Watcher merely traveling through time and space, or also through parallel universes? This would normally be a stupid question, but there are many aspects in a few of these regions that seemingly contradict information we already know. Solid example, signal spires. Signal spires is a Sky Islands-esque area, clearly made up of these signal towers atop a structure. Though we can see what these structures look like, they're huge, poking above the clouds in a way almost exactly like Iterator structures do. Looking at it from outside the game's universe, these structures are literally based off of a concept idea for the Iterator superstructures. Could these just be a different model of structure, or are they something from an alternate timeline? Now, I personally hate the idea of parallel universes, so I'm going to act as though everything we see in The Watcher canonically happens somewhere in the world at some point. Now, I could be wrong, don't take this as gospel like I know many of you do, but I think parallel universes are stupid and don't really have a place in the lore, and it makes my analysis a lot cooler if I actually take every bit of information into account as canon. My theory on signal spires is that these structures are a different model of Iterator, likely on a completely different continent from everything else. As we know, the regions found in the Watcher likely come from all around the world. All in all, though, the regions we see in the Watcher don't actually tell us that much. The heavy hitters would probably be Signal Spires and Outer Rim, both of which I don't have the time to fully discuss. The other structures we see mostly just elaborate on aspects we haven't seen before. Stormy and Shrouded Coast tell us that the ancients would ship large amounts of material in barges. We can see shipping containers and cranes with hooks on them in an area explicitly called the coast. Turbulent pump and verdant waterways show us how they would filter their water, as does salination. The two curious ones I want to discuss here in depth would be cold storage and desolate tract. Cold storage was very likely a purposed organism development facility. Lizards and other creatures are kept in cages, and the area is full of tubes likely used to keep creatures in, many of which have been broken. This tells us that purposed organisms were likely made using live specimens, maybe even bred rather than being manually augmented. Though the technology is still quite vague, and maybe this is more of a basic research facility as opposed to one specifically used for purposed organism research. Though considering half of it is taken over by the rot, something that explicitly appears whenever purposed organism experimentation like this goes too far, I'd like to assume it's about purposed organism development and not just general science. Desolate Tract, on the other hand, is mostly just weird because... what? It's a massive tract of perfectly flat land dotted with holes. Structures lay broken in the distance, but the entire area isn't just caves and rock, it's metal. What purpose could this place have served? Maybe wind power? I'm not sure, but it does confirm that the ancients were capable of some truly terrifying feats of engineering used for seemingly no purpose. I'm very excited to analyze a lot of these regions in my upcoming region analysis, but for now we're going to have to leave it there. Because, in all seriousness, you know I'm beating around the bush here. That's obvious enough. Anyone who's completed The Watcher knows exactly what I'm about to talk about here. The main reason why I'd even make a second ancient analysis video, why I'd spend half of it just telling you shit you already know, it's because of Ancient Urban. In the first ending of the Watcher DLC, the echo that has been leading you throughout the entire DLC up until this point takes you somewhere unique. An ancient city. Not the old ancient cities you would have walked through in Downpour, a proper living space. You start in a dingy sewer system, rats and moths fly around you, huge, still, functional machinery looms in the background. Exploring the area, you eventually reach an area called the Workshop, what looks to be a storefront filled with basic things an ancient would utilize. We can see their masks, pearls, vases with natural urges placed upon them, baskets, plates, tools, and other trinkets all line the shelves, and in the window, we can see the silhouettes of still living ancients walking past. Now this is a really cool moment and all. Bravo, James, you did a great job. Your whole team, you did incredible, yada yada yada. But we need to take a quick detour here because we need to discuss the size of the ancients. It's always been up for debate, but if I hear a single one of you motherfuckers touting that the slugcats are the size of the ancients' toes, I'm gonna rip you to shreds with my teeth. I know it literally shows us the size disparity in the window, but I don't trust this. I think it's exaggerated by light and perspective because it contradicts itself multiple times in the same region. It contradicts itself multiple times in the same room. Look at the size of these masks. If an ancient were to stand up and wear this mask, it wouldn't even be able to peek its head out of the window. It simply doesn't add up, and you want to know what makes this an open and shut case in my eyes? If you make the ancients this size, not only does it line up with the multiple ladder-like structures we've seen, it also makes them the exact same size as the echoes. Funny how that does it. Why the fuck did Video Cult make the window this big? You are making my job harder. Slugcat is like a foot tall at most, and yes, that does mean that the Iterators are teeny tiny. I think they should be teeny tiny as a treat. I think the Ancients made them that way because they thought it would be funny. All in all, though, while we're on the topic of the Ancients' height, we should also probably discuss what the Ancients looked like and what their body plan was. Now, Ancient Urban mostly just tells us their size compared to Slugcat, but using that, we can extrapolate a pretty solid guess as to the size of the Ancients. Your average Ancient was about 4 to 5 Slugcats tall and wore a huge mask atop their head that makes up about a quarter of their height. These masks are often ornate and likely quite heavy. They would be adorned with beads, feathers, or whatever the Ancient was attached to. Their bodies were sometimes covered in wrappings, but their clothing varies a lot. From tunics to leotards to robes, the only solid consistency between them is that they almost always wore at least one piece of intricate gold or beaded jewelry. This might also be biased from seeing the murals where the Ancients would naturally want to paint themselves as their ideal beauty standards. Either way, we can extrapolate that jewelry mattered a lot in ancient civilization. Onto the topic of their biology, though. They were bipedal, and from what we can see in the murals, their bare skin was either one single solid color or had some weird patterning, maybe tattoos on it. The topic of their hands is kind of weird. We only ever see hands in the original 5 Karmic murals as wrapped, but there's one specific mural that I think is from Downpour that shows they have 4 fingers and a thumb, which again, because it's Downpour, means it might not really be up for serious consideration. There's another cut mural as well that shows them with 4 fingers and a thumb, but that mural also shows underneath their mask, which looks almost like a weird squishy octopus thing, and I don't think it shows up anywhere in game, and it might also be Downpour. So realistically, I don't think we're really supposed to consider it, and if we are, I hope not, because it's ugly. There's also the topic of the tiny little nub tail that they have at the end of their spinal cord. That's kind of funny. The main thing that I want to discuss here is their feet, though. They seem to have 2 different types of feet. Large, curved, bird-like feet only ever seen wrapped up, and ones that would fit into sneakers. My theory on this is that the bird feet are the normal type, but there's a culture similar to foot binding that causes the Ancients to value smaller feet that fit into these shoes. Due to the fact that we've never once seen the Ancients without their masks on, we're kind of left to assume what they could possibly be underneath it. There are a few examples that I find around the area that sort of makes me think that they're birds. The main thing for that would be the weird bird feet, but there's also feathers seemingly coming out of a lot of their masks, which could 100% just be fully ornate feathers that don't have any actual meaning and were plucked from birds. Or maybe there's something more important for us to look at. Either way, I don't think we're supposed to know. There is also the fact as well that all the echoes have long, snout-like, noodly protrusions at the end, which could have been an approximation of a beak. I'm not sure. I don't think we're supposed to be sure. I don't think we're supposed to know at all, but that's my guess. Phew, sorry about that. That was a really long tangent. I didn't know where else to put it, but moving back to Ancient Urban, we don't actually know where it sits on the timeline. We know at least that it's after the Void Fluid Revolution, but is it before or after the Iterators? At first I assumed after, due to the, astonishingly modern-seeming architecture, though this architecture also seems very similar to the ones we'd see in those areas below the clouds. Not to mention, we also don't see any architecture similar to the city we see atop 5 Pebbles. I'm aware Metropolis is non-canon, but the buildings we see here are all ground level, and we see large sewer networks that would only be possible with sturdy ground beneath them. It's hard to tell, though if I had to guess, I'd place it before Iterators, or at least on a ground level city, due to the fact that we don't see any Iterator elements anywhere, nor any suggestion of them in the Echo's dialogue. Maybe I'm wrong, but in my opinion, Ancient Urban occurs before the Iterators. After the workshop segment, we see a few other super important things. Namely, we see an ancient child's living space, which once again enforces my size estimate. We see water storage vessels, a vista of the skyline, and most importantly, a fully functional ancient ascension temple. We see the 5 murals of the natural urges lead into a room filled with still-lit candles. The architecture looks very similar to the depths, and in the center lies a grate with void fluid beneath. The Echo sits above it and describes the process of being ascended. They mention pipes, a bath, and gravel. Could it be that they ready you for ascension by feeding you that old, bitter tea and gravel? They describe the bath being laid for them and their departed essence flowing through a sluice, a sort of valve that controls the flow of fluid in a pipe. They get reduced into a soup of proteins and acids, travel through a thin grate, and then they're gone. Not just that, in the back of the area we see a coffin with pipes connected to it. Could that soup they turn into be filed away in a coffin somewhere? Spinning Top, the echo we hear this from, shines a whole new light into ancient culture in a way we've never seen before. And now that we're done talking about the stuff we see in ancient urban, I can't hold myself back anymore. I need to talk about Spinning Top. Now, this echo is an incredible look into what being an ancient was like. But let's start from the top, pun not intended. Spinning Top was an ancient child that was forced to ascend at a young age. Them being a child tells us many things. First off, the ancients were still having kids despite ascensionism saying no to that, the horny bastards. But if you think about it, isn't Spinning Top a weird ancient name? It sounds a bit more like an Iterator name. Chasing Wind, 5 Pebbles, Spinning Top. Mostly ancient names have 2 segments to them. The first segment would describe one thing, the second segment would describe another. For example, 19 Spades Endless Reflections. But Spinning Top is a lot more simple than that. Could it be that when an ancient is born, they're granted one name and then get that second half of it later? Maybe the first half of the name describes who they are as a child and the second describes who they are as an adult. Maybe it's more complex than that. Take, for example, a bell, 18 amber beads. This could have referred to a bell that this ancient liked as a child, and the jewelry that they wore as an adult. That analysis of the naming structure is interesting on its own, but Spinning Top tells us even more. Just simple things, the way that they describe living as a young ancient tells us a lot. The most notable one is that they describe living in a creche, which is a type of nursery or just a word for a child care facility where kids go to get taken care of by people other than their parents. Spinning Top also describes having songs sung to them by people that they call nest mothers. In fact, Spinning Top actually describes having a number of mothers and fathers as well. Could it be that Spinning Top doesn't know who their actual biological parents are? Or maybe the culture is so different that less weight is put onto the concept of biological parenthood. Maybe they do literally have multiple mothers and fathers who took care of them over their young life. Though there's also something to keep in mind as well. There's that one pearl in Memory Crypt that describes the ancient as both a mother and a father, which could be cycle nonsense, or they could just be a bigender icon. Either way, it implies something funky going on that we don't know about yet. There are a lot of aspects of ancient culture that we learn about through Spinning Top, but I feel like easily the most important thing they tell us, although vaguely, is that the ancients' culture was not against ascending a child. If we continue with the idea that ancient urban occurs before the Iterators, which, to clarify, is not proven, we find a reality where, for whatever reason, a child was forced, unwillingly, into giving up their life. We know it was unwilling because, they echoed. This shows that the culture of detachment was still going strong. Spinning Top describes watching throughout all time to find whether anyone noted their absence, recognized that they weren't there, and found nothing. This culture where everything is so wrapped up in an inevitable perfect death that the beauty of life is alien to them. Even a child was merely granted the ceremonies and sent on their way. Did they become too burdensome for the creche? Did they not have any prospects? Did one of their parents wish for it to happen? There could have been any number of reasons why people wouldn't want a child around. Either way, it happened and Spinning Top wasn't there anymore. This concept of a culture of detachment that I keep throwing around is really important when discussing the philosophies behind the ancients. Ancient people indulged in a lot of natural urges despite everything. Multiple pearls talk about their jewelry, they're often seen decked out in ornate clothing. They clearly expressed individuality through possessions, despite materialism being considered a natural urge and therefore bad. They would have children as seen through Spinning Top, despite that being another natural urge. They would indulge in a sweet nectar as shown through the Farmer-Raised Pearl, despite that being yet another natural urge. But all of these things are done in detached ways. The possessions are all for the purpose of abating the self. The children are cared for in huge creches, so none can actually grow attached to them. They lived lives quite similar to ours, but burdened by the idea that to strive, to enjoy, was bad. So they floated through life, detached from everything, giving way to more ancients who were also detached from everything, and finally giving rise to the Iterators, their children, who barely gave them a second thought. It's exactly as Moon said. Their main ambition was the pursuit of a lack of ambition. They tried so hard to be effortless, and for what? They were transient up until the end, leaving behind nothing but old wreckage and the echoes of their failures. Now, I don't mean to act like my views on them are entirely proven. I just think it's really cool. The entire story that Spinning Top tells us is probably my favorite thing in the entirety of Rainworld. Like, ever. I am obsessed with the idea that the ancients were so obsessed with death that their entire culture suffered and they were making themselves miserable. I think that's really cool. Going further into the themes of Rainworld as a whole, the story seems to have a discussion of endings, I suppose. That almost hopeful knowledge of something being over. Downpour does it really well by illustrating Five Pebbles' downfall and redemption, and then wrapping everything up with the Saint. The Watcher does it really well through showing us how Spinning Top accepted their own end, while also showcasing that that same fervent desire to end can be very unhealthy through the Prince. The base game has a little bit less of a individual character-driven story like the two DLCs do. It's much more focused on the grandness of the world and your small state in it. But still, the entire world of Rainworld is sort of about accepting that ending. And I feel like the Ancients being shown as not good, actually, is kind of an interesting way to look at it. The Watcher especially reinforces this. The base game of Rainworld doesn't really comment on the Ancients that much, outside of keeping them mysteriously in the background, but the Watcher comments a lot on how bad it is to want everything to end. The Prince sought that end to the cycle, and by following him you get the worst ending, whereas Spinning Top's ending showcases the Watcher's renewed desire to live, almost, unless I'm interpreting that wrong. I'm very curious to see how Video Cult handles the idea that the Ancients' culture was not a healthy one. Assuming that they actually do a third DLC, which, if you watch my interview, James Primate expressed interest in, so big win for us Rainworld obsessors, we're gonna be here until 2040. If they continue with this trend of character-driven stories in the Rainworld universe, it's almost inevitable that we're going to see more of the way that the Ancients affected things, be that their own ancient children or their metaphorical children in the form of the Iterators. I'm really curious to see what they do, and I'm going to be here the whole time, so even if I get like 500,000 million views on Necopara videos over the course of the next 3 years, I'm still going to be making Rainworld content. You can't get rid of me that easily, sorry. But anyway, after that long-ass unscripted tangent, we find ourselves at the end of the video. Keep in mind that once again, if we include Downpour with all this, things get a lot weirder, and I don't think Downpour is canon for a few reasons, so I'm just not going to be including it. I'm quite satisfied with the observations I made in this video, and I hope you were too. The next video I'll be putting out would probably end up being the region analysis I've been talking about, so I hope you're all excited for that. After that, we got more fun stuff as I inevitably chip away at Flora-Fauna. Thank you all for watching as usual. Press the validation buttons to secure my egocentrism, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.